Government shutdown. This has happened so many times. I don't even know why we're talking about this. This is like the same thing over and over again. The government runs out of money, can't come up with a budget. I think what we should be doing is if the government can't come up with a budget, they should just throw the whole lot of them out and we reform a government like they do in the UK and Australia. Why is this any different?
I think this is different because one, the government never came up with a budget before the Federal Reserve was created, and then the federal government had an institution that it could be indebted to. So I think that the government shut down this time with Donald Trump's antics with regards to fighting the Federal Reserve, the attempts that he's made to draw the Federal Reserve under his control, both by trying to fire Jerome Powell and to dictate to Jerome Powell what the base interest rate should be for the Federal Reserve. The antics that he's pursued with Lisa Cook and trying to have her removed. I think this is all. Um, uh, I think that the way that this game is played this time is going to be very different. And in the past, we've had both the Democrats and the
Wait, so
Republicans.
this is actually a fight over the role of the Federal Reserve and its relationship to the government. That's what the shutdown is about?
I mean, I think that one in the times past when the government has shut down, neither of the parties or no faction within Washington was actually trying to change the American economic system. And we've talked at length about how Donald Trump is trying to get the United States off of a free trade system. So that means that also uh, with the other issues at hand in the history of Donald Trump and his administrations with regards to how they're getting along with, especially the Department of Justice and the FBI and maybe the CIA, but I would say particularly here with the Department of Justice and the FBI, and also the timeline of the release of information, the the um, the indictment of James Comey last week. This is going to be a very different fight, and I say that like in short. What is different this time is Donald Trump has no desire to reconvene the government. And he's going to take every advantage that he can while the government is shut down to um, further erode or end some of the positions that he has taken issue with. And I think those are going to be most evident in the pressure that he's been placing on the Department of Justice. And we haven't talked a lot about that because that is the stickiest of problems to deal with. And we also begin to understand this in Donald Trump's first term. Everyone was scratching their heads and saying, wait a second, who does the attorney general work for? Because the Department of Justice likes to put out that it's independent and that it's concerned with justice, but the Department of Justice is formed under the executive branch. And so whenever you have the attorney general who's not agreeing with the president, well, whenever you have the likes of Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon, who are advisors to the president, and they're summoned in, and all of a sudden the Department of Justice no longer honors very old ideas of confidence, that is diplomatic confidence and diplomatic immunity, that's to be held by the members of Trump's cabinet and his advisors. Um, there's a whole lot that's changed here, and so I think this is going to be when it happened, I thought this is like in a movie, when uh, when somebody cuts the lights on the set, or in a play when the lights are cut, what's going to happen? And that's the period that I'm thinking that we're in right now, and I'm not surprised to see Peter Navarro um, uh, releasing more information, tweeting more information, giving interviews in more depth about what the FBI and the Department of Justice have been up to in the last 10 years, ever since I mean, they're focusing on the timeline since Trump's first election, the Comey letter in that election. But there's a lot of information that we've been waiting on that has not been released, and I think we're going to get to see some of it. To add background or complexity to the situation, we also have the 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 United States relationship with Europe and Russia at hand, and that coming to a head over Ukraine, and the supposed coming war with Iran also coming to a point right now.
So the thought here is that Donald Trump is going to take this opportunity of the government being shut down to further an agenda that he has to rework the relationship between the government and the Federal Reserve and to reshape the government while it's shut down. This is his opportunity to do these things.
I, this is an opportunity in which, yes, the power and the influence of of Congress especially is greatly reduced. And the president also has newfound leverage in order to fire people or to simply not call them into work. And then if you think about how the government has worked in the past with regards to repaying, to furloughing, and paying back employees of the government afterwards, if Donald Trump is moving us away from being able to climb deeper into debt, to magically create money in order to pay off these employees, I think he's going to use that leverage to try to fire these employees. You also, we talked at length too about the veiled imperial order. This exists inside, especially the bureaucracies of the United States. It's very hard to pin down because it's about allegiances to a way that the country works within the rest of the world. And this is what Donald Trump, with his economic policies, I don't even know if we want to call them economic policies, his philosophy of America's relationship to the rest of the world is at hand here. And whenever I also see, Vladimir Putin giving a 4-hour interview, Kirill Dmitriev, and them doubling down on a strong relationship with the United States, and yet abandoning Europe and giving Europe up for loss. And I know that Donald Trump has a history of saying, "Let's get the United States out of NATO." We have JD Vance in tweets that were exposed saying Europe is a millstone around our neck, an albatross over our head, and yet on the face of it, in the recent past, we see Donald Trump um, voicing and voicing the worldview of the imperial order, the neocons, the liberal world order, in some of his statements, both to the world and here domestically at home. I took those as a summation to reveal the bankruptcy of those notions of how the world is to work and how the United States is to exist in them. And I say that is exposed by the actual movements that Donald Trump has made towards realigning the United States with Russia and with China. Um, so I think I think this is when the lights get cut and the players on the stage begin to reassemble themselves.
Doesn't
And
it make it harder for Donald Trump to do things within the executive branch when the government is shut down? I mean, when we think about what can actually happen during a shutdown, people can't come in and do stuff because they're not going to get paid unless they're going to come in out of the what goodness of their heart, or can they even come in? So what can the president do from the perspective of operating the executive branch while there's a government shutdown? I presume that everybody gets sent home, they're furloughed, whatever, and that they stop getting paid, and there would be no other opportunity at this point for those people who are the hands and eyes and ears and feet within the government to actually do the bidding of the executive branch.
So I mentioned on the outset that that there was not even a concept of the government shutting down until the creation of the Federal Reserve. And let's also go back and think about um, the narrative that was being bantied about whenever Donald Trump was supposedly looking at Matt Gaetz for his attorney general. And do you remember that that there was a little bit that was made about the possibility of recess appointments? And if we really begin to think about, what kind of country would allow the government to actually shut down? The shutdown is exactly what you just said. People aren't getting paid. But the reason that that elected officials, maybe not bureaucrats, but elected officials are in office are because they ran and they were elected and they take an oath. And they don't take an oath that says, I'm going to show up every 2 weeks and take a paycheck and do what I'm told. They take an oath that says that they're here to uphold the Constitution. And so regardless of whether they're being paid or not, they've taken an oath. And that aspect of the government doesn't shut down. Ideally, we still have the members of Congress who are negotiating to try to come to terms with how they're to reopen the financial arm of the government. But that's the only part that has quote unquote shut down. And so again, because Donald Trump is adamantly opposed to the way that side of the government operates, I don't think that Donald Trump is very interested at all in sending Republicans back to negotiate in good faith the terms to enter into more debt so that they can continue to fund the projects that the government has is engaged in, and like has this narrative about budgeting for. Well, they never meet these budgets. In the past, it's just been a digging. It's been a ball that's passed back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans, or whatever parties exist in Washington, and the debt gets meted out accordingly. And then that's the narrative that gets passed down to the American people. Donald Trump has never been interested in furthering that idea in how government is to operate. And I think we've had a long string of candidates, both Republican and Democrat, who've attempted, who have these narratives of I'm going to run government like a business, but then they get there and they figure out, oh, wait a second. When there's no backstop into the formation of debt, how do you run it like a business? Well, Donald Trump has had some very strange ideas from the outset, and I don't think that he's looked at this government shutdown traditionally as other candidates have. Now we layer on top of that. I mean, we can continue to talk about that if you'd like, but Tuesday,
Well, I'm somewhat before we get to this next part, I'm somewhat interested in this historical perspective on how the government operated prior to the Federal Reserve. So you said that's very curious to me because I never thought about how the government operated if it were to operate outside of a budget. How did things work before? Was it taxes were collected and things were paid for, but they didn't try to forecast how much was going to be brought in tax receipts? Or I guess I'm kind of curious how it did operate. Could you speak to it a little bit and just kind of give us that historical perspective on how things worked before the Federal Reserve?
Sure. Well, there's a big change that comes around at the time of the Civil War, but before the Civil War, the most important conversation
Always
that
the Civil War.
always
Always the Civil War.
so much changes. I mean, yeah, okay. Don't get me sidetracked with that conversation. But before the Civil War, if you look at the conversation that's held in Washington D.C., it's about the tariff. And the tariff is what was this notion of partly the American system, but the states. One there were monopolies that were granted by states and the senators, and and the representatives of the states sort of voted together to try to cordon off um, what what they were going to be, part of the economic engine in making. Think about Idaho potatoes. This is why Hawaii and sugar is so very important, and this begins to set up a relationship between corporations and the state. But um, so yes, before the Federal Reserve and before the government was in the business of selling its debt, which starts in the Civil War, they used to have to wait for money to come in from taxes and tariffs, and the money came in from the various states and or from international trade, and then the government was able to pay its debts and to continue forward. Um, the thing that changed in the Civil War, whenever Salmon P. Chase um, created the greenbacks, the paper currency to pay the Union soldiers, and then carried that system forward, was the government began selling those bonds, and this was in part because the Civil War was so very popular with the North. And not only that, but the banks that were in New York City, where the largest conglomeration of banks were at the time of the Civil War, they were aligned with the South, and New York was a port that was a connection point between the British imperial trade system, and cotton was grown with cheap labor, and vast amounts of land, acquired land in the South, and then it was transported to New York City, where it was put on boats. And the New York City, on the outset of the Civil War, said, our streets will grow over with grass, and our ships will rot in our ports if we destroy this trade with the imperial system. And so Abraham Lincoln, I said SPC earlier. It was Abraham Lincoln and SPC. They said, well, this war is so popular with the American people, we can turn to the people and sell the debt to the people. And so this is where the war bonds came around. But anyway, fast forward then to this sort of changed the relationship with banks and the government, and the banks begin to understand, oh, we can be buying the debt of the federal government. What a great idea! And come 1913, the Federal Reserve is created. It's not a central bank; it's a private bank, but it buys the debt from the United States Treasury, and then ostensibly turns around to sell it or to monetize it. That's why there was no federal budget that could rely on um, on there being an entity that was out there to buy the debt. Before, they had to turn to, oh, and I never can remember his name. I've brought his name up before, but the first fall guy for the American debt system was a friend of SPC. Later, J.P. Morgan Chase would organize bankers to buy out that debt to uphold the system, but but you can kind of see how that system grows out of history. But it hasn't always been that way. Certainly not on the outset of the American experiment.
So it used to be that the government would collect tariffs, would collect taxes, all of this gold would come in, silver, I guess, so this bimetallism would come into the treasury, and then they would spend down this dragon's hoard of cash that they had accumulated, and this was the mechanism. So they didn't do forecasting; they would collect the money, and then they would do spending of money that had already been collected. They would collect it and then they would dole it out to do whatever it is that the government deemed it needed to do. So this idea that there would be a budget really came out of this debt system that originated in the Civil War and then was perpetuated forward after the creation of the Federal Reserve.
And I'd like to add too that when we talk about the financial system of the world being very interested in monetizing war, which is true now, and we also see Germany and European economies turning to this notion of, oh, we're going to reorganize our economy about creating tools of destruction. Oh, fast or go back to 19 or 1860. Whenever Lincoln was talking to the bankers of New York, they said war is incredibly destructive, and what will happen will be you will ruin the ability to create to create wealth, to create cotton in the South, and ultimately we will all go bankrupt. And Abraham Lincoln said to them, he said, "Oh, no, 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 no! I'm going to have you create. I'm going to have you make rifles, and I'm going to have you make clothes, and all the other things that the federal government needs in order to have this war, and you will be rich." So when we go back to this idea that wars are profitable and there are profiteers from war, it wasn't originally the private banks who understood it this way. They were lured into that understanding of what their role is in a war by politicians and by no less than Abraham Lincoln. So anyway, I think that's enough history. We've also got a lot more that's happening on the ground, especially in the last couple of days, with Donald Trump and around the world. Ready? Are you ready to turn to that, or you got any more questions?
Let's go. Let's get into the now. It's good to get that historical perspective, though, because I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we know how things work now, but they haven't always worked this way. So yeah, let's get back to the present day.
Well, talking about how things work now, I was shocked, shocked, I tell you, on Tuesday whenever Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump convened all of the generals and the admirals of the United States military at Quantico to have a quote unquote pep talk with them on Tuesday. And the first thing that shocked me was the number of generals and admirals that were in the audience. Did you have any idea that we have over 800 generals in the United States military?
I hadn't. When you told me that number, I was shocked. That's a surprising number of these are four-star generals, right?
I don't think they were all four-star generals, but they were the top generals and top admirals. Rusty, you may know more about that. Do you have some sort of idea of whether it was just the four stars or how many generals the United States military has writ large?
Um, no, I'm not quite knowledgeable on how many exact generals the United States military has at large. I would think for that large of a number, it'd have to be all generals, not just four star. Four star, at least in the Marine Corps, is a pretty elite rank. There wasn't very many of them out there, and because I come from the Marines, my idea and sense of what that numbers could be skewed because the numbers of the Marines are so much lower than say the Navy or the Army or the Air Force, where they give a lot of general ranks around.
Well, and I don't know if you caught the speech that both Hegseth and then there was an interlude of some inspiring, um, uh, uh, John Philip Sousa music, and then Donald Trump came on. But so it was shocking to me the number of generals there. It was further shocking to hear Pete Hegseth, uh, both the well, I guess one of the generals, some general one of the narratives that came out of it was a general said this could have been done in an email. And when we think about the price tag that the United States paid to convene all of these generals in Quantico, it was upwards of $100 million to fly them and their aides and everybody to Quantico. And then for Pete Heg,
This is like Donald Trump's return to office mandate. Could be done in an email, but he said, "I demand you show up in person."
and
It
and
it kind of uh, sorry, I was gonna say it kind of reminds me of they always have these things in the military, these big demonstrations. They always used to call them dog and pony shows, where they just go through all these outrageous pre extravaganza just for one event that doesn't really seem like it's that important.
Well, and I love the phrase "dog and pony show." That's exactly what this was. But we should not be cajoled into thinking that this was about the dogs and ponies. There was a reason that Donald Trump convened all the generals here and then besmirched their honor by delivering such a message of no importance, and also the things that were carried in that message, telling them to get the DEI woke agenda out, telling them that they needed to be on board. Those were things that I saw as a sieve, and was basically saying to the military, or to the generals, that was a coded message that said there's going to be some big changes coming, and you need to be on board, or you need to get out now. Like, Donald Trump is not interested in the antics of General Milley, from his first administration. And if you remember, General Milley, whenever Donald Trump was in the trade war with China, called his counterpart, the leader of the Joint Chiefs over in China, and said, that China is not actually threatened. This is a lot of bluster by the president. And then whenever that was discovered, he stood up and gave a speech that said, that the military officers ought to took an oath to the Constitution, and that was their authority, not some, in his words, supposed dictator. And that's not the full oath that he took. The American servicemen take an oath to the Constitution and to the president. So, understanding that, I think a longer or a deeper understanding of how the American military is supposed to work is that if military officers don't agree, then the proper course for them is to resign. And I think we can expect to see some resignations from this massive cadre of generals, because amongst the points that Donald Trump laid out was that he wanted to dramatically decrease the size of the military, and he also wanted to erase some of these notions of the speciality of the forces. I think, Rusty, that means the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force. This all gets the Army. This all gets returned to one block that has specialized units in it. But Donald Trump, no, actually, I believe it was Pete Hegseth said, the military was made to fight wars, not to provide defense. And Donald Trump talked about the decision and the disagreements in the decision to change the name of the department back to the Department of War. But again, we know that Donald Trump wanted to remove the United States military from all of these bases from around the world. That was what Trump asked the Pentagon to do in his first administration. They balked. Now he's changing tactics. So again, to bring this back to the shutdown, whenever we have this sort of meeting that leads into the government shutdown, and also this meeting closed with Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth both saying our problem is at home, our vulnerability is at home, and we're going to get rid of some of the rules of engagement. Now, that doesn't mean the Geneva Conventions. I think what that's talking about is the rules of engagement with regards to enemy combatants. And already we've also seen the Trump administration say that now those people who the government identifies as engaging in fencing or distributing drugs, being members of drug cartels, are on the table as enemy combatants. And so also Donald Trump said that they are going to use American cities as training grounds for this new military. And so what does that tell us? That Donald Trump is going to move the military into American cities, and the reason for being in those cities is going to be to curb civil violence and also drugs, the drug trafficking in the cities. And We've also seen, hints of this in the past. We've talked about what occurred in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. But here Donald Trump is bringing that around. Now, understanding that, we also have to wonder, well, what about the United States? Again, the role with NATO, our role with NATO, and our presence in Asia, and we are currently sending tankers and aircraft back to Qatar, um, and Israel and Iran are on the verge of breaking out in more open warfare. We saw Donald Trump foil that earlier in the summer, a couple of months ago, with this targeted bombing of the nuclear sites in Iran, and that was a move that was calculated to foil a broader war, the United States being dragged into a broader war. I'm not sure what's going to happen this time, but I do know that with the timing of the calling of the heads of the military in, and to have a talk to redirect their concern towards domestic issues, I don't expect that the United States involvement in this broader Iranian or a deepening NATO conflict are going to happen. Again, with the government shutting down, the lights are off.
Well,
And
does
Donald,
that mean? I guess that's a curious part of the shutdown. I imagine that the defense part of the United States, or the war part of the United States, does not shut down in a shutdown. Are they exempt? I mean, it's not like when we have a government shutdown, they say, well, the tankers, they just got to come home, and all the aircraft carriers, they got to come home. I imagine none of that really is affected by the government shutdown.
no, the only people that aren't called into work and supposedly in the past have gone on furloughed, I think Donald Trump is going to fire them, are the auxiliary, the executive agencies. The military does not shut down. You can imagine the military having to shut down when the United States can't get soldiers to work for the paper money that was, the greenbacks that were created under the time of Lincoln. But the system has still been perpetuated, that the money goes around in a great circle. There's a whole bunch of entities that are involved in it. But this leads me to the last sort of item of concern. On October the 1st and October the 2nd, the United States Treasury had to buy back $4.5 billion of bonds that were not bought in open auctions. And then we also see, the Tether, which is another USDT. Tether is another bank of new creation that has a magic ability to be able to purchase a United States debt. Printed a couple of $1 billion worth of Tether in order to buy both Bitcoin and more United States bonds. So I'm not sure.
Now there's a wash if I've ever seen one. It's you're creating money out of thin air, selling it off into the open market, and buying the hardest money that exists on the planet, buying Bitcoin.
Well, this is the magic. This is the beauty of technology, is that it compresses some of these things that have been happening over more opaque political structures for 100 years in the past. And yeah, it is a wash. That's a great thing to call it. But as the world and the American people, and especially American soldiers, wise up to what's happening, I don't expect that system is to hold. I don't think that Donald Trump expects it to hold either. And he's been absolutely desperate. He's also had a timeline or a time window of 90 days under the emergency powers that he can operate under, in order to set up the tariffed fair trade system throughout the world. And so while diplomats and economists have been screeching in protest as to why he acts so abruptly, the reality on the ground is that he had a 90-day window, and then he was going to have a domestic fight against Congress back here in the United States. And that timeline has also drawn to a close at the end of September. So here we are on the precipice of a new era in the United States relationship with the other countries of the world, and also our relationship with the political entity that enforced the former relationship since World War II. That was the American military. So the timing of that meeting on September the 30th, and the things that have happened since then, um, this is a moment of reset, and it's a very important time for us to be paying attention to what's going on.
Any final thoughts on the conversation from today? So we'll be watching very closely what's going on with the government shutdown, the relationship to the Federal Reserve, and also what's happening with the U.S. military. I'm just curious if you've got any final thoughts before we wrap it up here for today.
My final thought would just be that the Department of Justice is, has the or I'll say more broadly, the judiciary has a a reputation in the United States, and that reputation has been eroded, especially since Donald Trump took office in his first term. But the Department of Justice is a department that exists under the executive branch. And it and the FBI are created in the wake of the Civil War, when the federal government begins to assume national powers. And we hear very little from the administration or the government, or at least we have until recently heard very little about the corruption and the collusion. There's a good word. The corruption and the collusion of the Department of Justice. And when I say the collusion, I'm talking about between judges and prosecutors. Those are supposed to have the blindfold of justice and to operate in the guise of seeking truth. But whenever we look and see how the Department of Justice works and how it abuses the power of the government against defendants, that's something that Donald Trump was made very aware of during his last administration, but especially during the Biden administration. And I think that's where his top target is. So again, when I think that we're going to see some of the greatest changes in what, where there has been precedent for allegations and for political movements in the past. I think we're going to see them with regards to targets in the Department of Justice. We've seen politicians be dragged in front of the American, into the narrative, allegations made, et cetera, and this might happen all the way to Barack Obama. But I think we're going to see that with regards to a lot of members of the Department of Justice, and we haven't seen that in the past. So anyway, long-winded, but that's where I'm sensing a great, another great change in the American citizens' relationship with our federal government that Donald Trump is fighting to bring to the fore.
All right, and with that, we'll see you next time on FOMO.